he and Lita Hudson, professor of computer science, as well as the chair of the computer science at Columbia University. She's had a very interesting career in both industry and academia. She was at Bell Labs and AT&T Labs for many years during the real heyday of speech recognition work. And then eventually she went on to join Columbia University. While she was at AT&T, she actually created the Human-Computer Interface Research Department. So Julia is considered a pioneer in the area of speech recognition, especially. She also serves as editor-in-chief of computational linguistics, as well as another journal, Speech Communication. So besides all her own accomplishments, she's also rendered a lot of service to the community. She serves on several committees, including the Speech and Language Processing Technical Committee, the Executive Board, as well as something that we spoke to her about today. She's very involved in issues related to encouraging women in STEM disciplines. And in fact, she's on the board of the CRAW, which is very active in women. So it's very nice to see quite a few females in the audience. All the males are also welcome, of course. She's won several honors. She's a AAI Fellow, an ACL Fellow, and I believe just recently was named as an ACM Fellow. So without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce Julia.
Thank you all, and thank you for inviting me. Hoping that the people in back, if my voice begins to waver or get a little lower, please just raise your hands and I'll speak out. It's a pretty good sized room. So I'm going to talk about some work that we've been doing recently the past 2 or 3 years, continuing some work that we did before in studying how speech can convey useful information about people who are interested in deception detection. And I want to acknowledge a number of my collaborators here, in particular Sergeant Levitan and Roseanne Ahn, who are PhD students on this project. Michelle Levine, who is a psychologist who provides us with some very useful psychological angle. Andrew Rosenberg, Joachim Edison, and the young two who are going to be doing some of the work that I'll mention at the end, such as more indifferent stuff. So the outline of my talk today, I want to first provide some motivation to those of you who are deeply involved in deception detection and with my microphone. Okay. Okay. Oh, all right. Better. Okay. So first I want to define deception, and then at least how we are defining it. I want to talk about some of the different ways that other people are involved in studying deception in different modalities. Some of the cues we're going to be looking at in deception detection from speech. I'll talk a little bit about some studies we did in the past on the human ability to detect deception. And then I'll go on to the meat of the talk, which will be some current cross-cultural studies, which are examining the role of ethnicity, that is ethnic background, gender, and personality factors in detecting deception. I'll talk a little bit about some preliminary classification studies that we've been doing on a portion of the data, and then some future work. And if I have time, I'll tell you about some very recent work where we're just getting some new results on different aspects of deception detection. So our definition of deception is one that is commonly accepted in the field. It's a deliberate choice to mislead without prior mortification to gain some advantage or to avoid a penalty. So this does not include things like you go to a theater, you know you're going to be deceived in some sense, but you already know that these people are pretending, they're not lying. So it's not self-deception. It's not delusion or pathological behavior. It's not theater. And of course, it's not falsehoods that may be due to ignorance or error. You may just not know what you're talking about, but you're not actually lying. So everyday white lies have been found to be very, very difficult to detect, although people, according to some studies, people tell about 2 of these a day. So you might think back on how many lies you have told today that are of a white nature, that is, you did so in order to make somebody feel better about their new haircut or something like this. Serious lies, however, are thought to be very difficult to detect, and that's the ones that we're going to focus on, at least the way we simulate more serious lies. So why are serious lies difficult to detect? Well, the hypothesis is that our cognitive load is increased when we lie, because we have to remember what we've said that is inaccurate. We have to keep our story straight. We have to remember what we have said and also what we haven't said, lying in terms of omission. And the notion is that our fear of detection is increased if we believe that our target is hard to fool or suspicious. And that's why when you're talking to somebody, a TSA agent who's asking you, did anyone give you anything to take with you before you get on the plane, you begin to get a little nervous and you start thinking, did anybody give me anything? Oh, does this count? It's a present that I got for my aunt, da-da-da-da. So that's why you get a little bit nervous when you're confronted by somebody who seems to be an authority figure, like someone in a uniform, for example. So our fear of detection is also increased when the stakes are very high. So, for example, when you're, again, since I've just been in the airport, when you're in the airport, you realize that you've left your pocket knife in your backpack, and you really don't want to lose the 5th pocket knife that you have lost because someone detects it. Now, that's not a serious penalty, but it's something that at least makes you think about it. But if you think that you're actually going to be arrested, then your fear of detection is very, very high. Or if you think that you can gain some serious advantage by lying. So the idea is that these factors make it very difficult for us to control the indicators of deception. And our hypothesis is that some of these indicators are indicators that appear in speech. So there are many different approaches to deception detection. For example, people have found evidence that changes in body posture or gestures. For example, it might be touching your hair when you're asked a question, touching your face. It might be complete shifts in posture when somebody asks you a difficult question for you to answer. Also, there are hypotheses that micro-expressions, these are fleeting expressions that pass across your face which seem to contradict some of the words that you are saying. For example, I hope I can say this here. If I say, I love Donald Trump, hopefully there will have been an expression that might contradict that. And also, there are biometric factors. I'm sure you're all aware that the polygraph is only reliable at chance, and some people who may think otherwise are probably mistaken. But also there have been hypotheses that changes in body odor are also indication of deception. Also changes in brain activity have been hypothesized, that different portions of your brain light up, as it were, if you're telling something that actually occurred to you versus if you're telling something that you're making up. This actually resulted in the conviction of a woman in India for murder, which later was reversed when people got more sensible and realized that this was not actually a validated and truly reliable indicator of deception. And also, closer to what we're doing, there have been a lot of efforts to understand how what is said and how it is said lexically, for example, in statement analysis, can indicate at least that somebody, you should follow up on the story that they're telling. So current approaches to deception detection include training human beings to be able to interview and interrogate people. We actually took some of these courses from John Reed and Associates, who are some of the biggest trainers in deception detection of police and of military interrogators. And while they are very good at getting conviction, it's not entirely sure that they're always accurate in getting people to confess. But that is one of the main ways that deception detection happens in the real world by people who are trained in these sorts of behavioral analysis of interview and interrogation. There are also a number of laboratory studies of production and perception of psychologists and people in the communication world. And there are also automatic methods such as the polygraph or Neuroticism, for a while after 9/11 was one of the biggest sellers of deception detection technology, although studies by others showed that their methods, which were to detect something called microtremors in speech, were no better than the polygraph. However, they did produce a very interesting program that you can download into your Skype app, which is called the love detector. And it's supposed to tell you if the person you're speaking with really loves you or not. So you can do that if you want to, but you might be deceiving yourselves. So what we found when we first started our work on deception detection was that some of the things that were missing, particularly for the work on speech and language, was more objective and experimentally verified studies of cues to deception, which are better predictors of deception than humans or polygraphs. This was some years ago. A lot of work has been done more recently, in the past 10 years or so, that actually adds much to these studies. But at the time, this was what we were interested in doing. So our method was, and is, to identify acoustic, prosodic, and lexical cues that could be extracted automatically from speech, as well as using some simple personality features, which we recently started looking at. We wanted to understand the statistical correlations of some of these cues with deception, and we also wanted to use machine learning techniques to train models that could classify deceptive versus non-deceptive speech. So that's our research agenda, both correlations and classification accuracy. So some previous work that we did right after 9/11, we got funded by the Department of Homeland Security to work on deception detection from speech. We created, at the time, what was a pretty large corpus of deceptive and non-deceptive speech. If any of you are interested, it's available through the Linguistic Data Consortium. We finally felt that we had run all of the information that we could ourselves out of it, so we decided to let other people give it a try. So these were within subject recordings of deceptive and non-deceptive speech from 32 native speakers of standard American English. They were mostly Columbia students, and that's one of the issues with a lot of the work on deception detection, which may be of interest to some of you in the room. A lot of it is done on students, so I don't know if that proves useful or not. These were 25 to 50-minute interviews by a trained interviewer, trained in the Reed technique. And it was 15 hours of speech or so, and about 7 hours from subjects. For speech corpora, that's pretty small, but for deception corpora, particularly cleanly recorded at the time, it was pretty large. So subjects were given some tasks to do. We wanted to get them involved in things. And they were incentivized later to lie about their performance on the task. And they identified ground truth themselves by some pedal presses during the interview process. So these were the kind of features that we looked at. And these are the same kind of features that we're going to be looking at in our current research. So we're interested in pause. We're interested in duration. We're interested in speaking rate, and we're interested in how loudly people speak or how softly. We're also interested in whether people raise their pitch or lower their pitch. And we're also looking at some voice quality features. A number of these features have actually been incorporated into some of the efforts that the John Reed and Associates use in teaching deception detection. They'll say, well, if a person raises their pitch or lowers their pitch significantly, that may be an indicator that they have something to hide. And pausing too much, or filled pauses where you say and ah, might also be an indicator of deception. So what we've done is take a lot of the features that practitioners use and try to operationalize these so that we can identify them automatically. There are a lot of lexical features. I'm not going to go over all of these with you, but also most of these come from practitioners' like intuitions about what kinds of things might actually contribute to deception detection. So for example, the complexity of your words. Are you speaking with longer words or with very simple words? Do you use contractions versus not? There's a notion that people, when you use a contraction where people normally would not use a contraction and vice versa, this can actually, you should know this if you're ever interrogated, try to use contractions and don't say, I did not do it, say, I didn't do it. And this would be an indicator to an interviewer that you're telling the truth. So all these features we've examined because it's possible to examine them automatically, and they're derived from features that people in the intelligence and military and police world have suggested might be important. We also use some subject-dependent features, like laughter, the presence of laughter, filled pauses, and cue phrases like well, now, and so on, because these too have been examined as possible cues to deception. For example, some people laugh more when they're deceiving, and other people might laugh less. So this might be something that would be significant to look at. So this is just a brief survey of the work that we've done before. And then I'm going to play you an example, which I can't actually, I'm not going to be able to play this unless very strange, okay. Somehow this is not working.
And when's the last time you were camping?
Camping? This past summer, actually. I was visiting a friend in Venezuela, and we went camping in the mountains there. So that was really fun.
Did that experience call on any of the surviving skills you seem to have picked up?
Okay, so the interviewer was the male voice, and the interviewee was the female voice. How many people thought she was lying? How many people thought she was telling the truth? A couple. The lies have it. Yeah, so this is just kind of a visual display of the kind of representation of some of the features we were looking at, pitch, intensity. You could get duration from this as well. And this shows you the transcriptions that we had and also the truth and lie identification of the different clauses that were being produced. So this is the kind of data and the kind of information that we were operating with. And the results were actually for us quite disappointing, but it turns out they were pretty good. So we had about 88 of these features that we normalized within speaker, and we derived these from 250 that we originally started with. They were lexical features, and then they were acoustic prosodic features, as well as some paralinguistic features. And our best performance was an accuracy of 70%. Now, how many people think that's good? Oh, thank you. We were kind of disappointed. 70%. So, and you know, we did some other F measures, and they got a little bit better performance if we fiddled around with, you know, whether we were predicting truth or lie. And basically we found that it was some lexical and subject-dependent features as well as some of the acoustic features. Pitch turned out to be pretty good. Intensity and speaking rate a little bit good. One thing we found out, and this is why I think our performance is better, is that there are vast individual differences in how people behave when they're deceiving versus not deceiving. For example, when I'm telling the truth, I tend not to look at people, not to look them in the eye. I've noticed this. And when I am telling the truth, when I'm telling the truth, I look away, and when I'm not lying, I would say, but when I'm deceiving in some kind way, I tend to look them in the eye. I won't be talking to any of the rest of you today. And so what we did notice in our subjects, and these are only 32 subjects, is when we looked at individual differences, they were really significant. In particular, some people, when they were lying, would raise their pitch, as opposed to when they were telling the truth, and other people would do the opposite. So this really hurts performance when you're trying to look at an entire group. However, another thing that made us feel a little bit better about our results is that what we decided to do with our data was to actually let humans try to make the same decision that the machine was making. So instead of running a classifier, we ran human classifiers. So we included some human judges to actually listen to our data and make decisions about which things were true and which things were false. So other people have found that human beings are pretty bad at detecting deception. Some people have found as little as, detection at chance. And there have also been studies that have shown that even when you tell people what sort of things to look at, they tend to go with their instinct about what they think. So for example, in our data, when people are using filter pauses like and they're actually telling the truth. That's a good predictor of truth-telling in this corpus. But if you tell people that, which we did not, but if you tell people that, they still will think that it's a cue to deception, because that's what anecdotally people have, I guess, come to believe. So there's a very interesting meta-study that I always like to show people, which looked at how different subjects behave and how they perform at deception detection. So what do you see here? First of all, on the top line, that criminals are the best of the subject populations that were examined in this study, and they're pretty accurate at deception detection. Not as good as our machine, but they're still pretty good. If you look at the red, the lines that are shown in red, these are military and police officers and other people who should be detecting deception, and they're actually not very good at it. Can anyone guess why? And particularly parole officers. Any guesses? It's because they tend to believe that lots of people are really lying. They deal with a population that's lying quite a lot to them, and so they tend to predict that people are deceiving more than they actually are. So our perception study, we had 32 judges, and we each rated 2 of our 25 to 50-minute interviews. And we gave them some pre- and post-test questionnaires to see how they thought they had done and to compare with how they actually did. And we also gave them the NEO-FFI 5-factor analysis inventory, because we hypothesized that it was possible that personality factors might actually be a good predictor of how well people did at judging deception or how poorly they did. So the 5-factor personality inventory includes things like an assessment, a scoring of extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, people are organized, thorough planner, neuroticism, and also something called openness to experience, which is having wide interests and being open to new experiences. And what we found was that, in fact, there were some important correlations between personality factors and people's ability to judge deception. So first of all, the nice thing is, remember we got 70% accuracy using our classification experiments. Well, the judges did actually worse than chance. Chance here would be predicting truth, and in fact, the average accuracy for judges was only about 58.2%. So this seems to confirm previous studies that people are really very bad at deception detection. However, you'll see that there was great variation between the people who did the best and the people who did the worst. And what we found was that actually people who are open to experience, who scored high in openness to experience and in agreeableness, actually tended to be the best judges, which makes some sense. These are people we thought, our explanation for this is that people who are less biased toward, openness to experience we could explain by if people who are open to new experiences, they may be basing their decisions on actual data rather than on prejudice. Neuroticism, people who scored high on neuroticism tended not to believe that people were lying. They wanted to believe that everybody was telling the truth. I do not know why this would be so, but this is the explanation that we came up with for this. And people who scored high on agreeableness, we tend to think are people who are more interested in other human beings and in understanding them and might be more open to picking up cues as to deception or lack of deception. At any rate, finding that personality factors were actually important in predicting who is a good judge of deception gave us the idea, when we started collecting a new data set, that we might actually find out if these individual differences that we identified in the way people behave when deceiving versus telling the truth might also be associated with personality factors. So here are this is our current data now that I'm moving to. And our hypotheses here are a little bit different from the other ones that we used in our earlier study. So first, we hypothesized that personality factors could help not only to predict differences in deceptive behavior, but also we hope to confirm that they could also predict differences in people's ability to detect deception. We also hypothesized that people who are better at deceiving might also be better at detecting deception. This is kind of following from the information that we had on how good criminals are at predicting deception in others, that they might also probably, we think, be deceivers, good deceivers themselves. We also hypothesized that there were cultural and gender differences in deceptive behavior and in deception detection abilities, following up on some studies that have been done on this. So here's our new task. We studied pairs of American native speakers of Standard American English and native speakers of Mandarin Chinese, but they're speaking English. And they're interviewing each other. And here's our experimental paradigm. So, first, we gave them a background survey for demographics, and we wanted to also to calibrate how well they knew English, because we felt that there might be some differences in the amount of study that they had previously done of English if they were not native speakers. So that was just a sanity check. Then we gave them a biographical questionnaire. The biographical questionnaire is here, and I'm not sure that you can read this. Can you? It's actually pretty big. But we asked them questions like, what's your mother's job? Do you have allergies to any food? Do you own a cat? That's my favorite question. I do own cats. Have you ever, and then more sensitive questions, like have you ever been in trouble with the police? Well, what's the most you ever paid for a pair of shoes? that proved to be a very interesting question. And did you ever cheat on a test when you were in high school? Another sensitive question. So what we asked them to do with these was, we gave them half of the questions we blacked out, as you see in this. We asked them to tell the truth about the ones where we had blacked out the second column. We asked them to come up with a plausible lie about the ones that were the last column was empty. And then we checked their lies to make sure that they weren't too close to the truth. For example, if your mother was a lawyer and your father was a doctor, we didn't want you to say as a lie that your father was a doctor and your mother was a lawyer. So we wanted to make sure that the lies were something they had come up with so that they felt that they could lie successfully about it, but they weren't too close to the truth. Okay, so they prepared that. Then we took a baseline sample. This was a series of questions that the interviewer, one of our students, asked them. And basically, we asked them to tell the truth. We took the baseline sample because we just wanted to get samples of their normal speech when they weren't in an interview situation where they had to lie versus tell the truth. This was about 3 to 4 minutes for each subject. And this turns out to have been an extremely useful thing in ways that we had not previously anticipated. So we then administered the same NEO-FFI 5-factor personality inventory, which Michelle Levine, our psychologist, would later score for us. So we have a lot of information from these people, and I've already gone over that for you. Then, after this, the line game began. So what subjects were instructed to do? The interviewer, the person, first of all, one person is going to have the role of the interviewer and the other of the interviewee. So the incentive to actually decide whether somebody is lying or not, or to lie successfully, is monetary. So the interviewers would get $1 extra each time they correctly detected a true answer or a lie. So you have to, in order to get more money than your standard fee, you have to be able to be a really good detector of truth versus lie. But each time they failed, they would lose $1. So people got quite competitive in this way. Now the interviewee would get $1 extra each time they succeeded in convincing the interviewer that what they said was true when in fact it was a lie. Okay? So you've got the competition going here. And after this, the interviewer and interviewee would switch roles. Okay? So each person got a chance to be the interviewer, each person got a chance to be the interviewee. And here's kind of what it looked like. These are, of course, 2 of our students and not our subjects. It's actually a pretty big double-walled sound booth in which we recorded everything that each person would say with a close talking microphone. And you'll notice, maybe, that each person, the interviewer, each time they made a statement, they would press a key depending on whether the statement was true or false. So we're getting ground truth from the people themselves, pressing a key to indicate that. So we're going to align that in the same way that we did in the previous study with the speech that they produce. Okay, and at the end they took a survey asking questions about how confident they felt, what kinds of features they used to determine whether somebody was lying or not. Okay, so we're going to evaluate success for the interviewee as how successful are they in convincing the interviewer that they're actually telling the truth when they're lying. That is, the number of lies that are believed true by the interviewer. And we're going to judge success for the interviewee on how often they were able to distinguish correctly a truth or a lie. So, here's another one I may be able to play.
I was born in Oakland, California, but I moved to LA like a few years when I was like in 3rd grade. well, right before 3rd grade.
Okay, once again, truth? Lie? She's lying. Both times. I should have mixed it up a little bit. Yeah, so rising intonation here, people might say, is a cue. There are also some pauses. So far, we don't know for our whole database what rising intonation or number of pauses actually indicates. So it's an open question. Okay, so what do we do with this? First of all, we had to get it annotated. So we used crowdsourcing. We had AMT, Amazon Mechanical Turk workers. Actually, it was 5 Turkers per utterance. I mistakenly thought it was 3 earlier today. And then we combined these using a Rover technique, which simply matches the transcription of each person, tries to get the best match, and then tries to get the most general correct response out of that. We segmented this using prot into interpausal units at 50 milliseconds of silence, so that we would have chunks of text and speech to analyze, both lexically and also acoustically and prosodically. And we automatically align the speech and the true lie labels using an aligner built with Kaldi, which is an open source machine learning tool. And so here's an example of Rover and one of the transcriptions that we had. So you see, basically, you can score it on how many words are agreed upon by the different transcribers. And if it got a score of, say, above 0.7, we accepted that as true. So there's a little bit of noise in our annotated data. So the current corpus collection, we have a balanced corpus of 140 pairs. It took several years to collect all of these. And that's about 112 hours of speech. We have a larger unbalanced corpus of 172 pairs and 122 hours of speech. And these are the largest cleanly recorded corpora of deceptive and non-deceptive speech that we know about. So this is some achievement of many, many of those people whose names I mentioned to you. We had a lot of people running subjects. So the results I'm going to present here are on an earlier version of this corpus. We just finished actually recording the entire thing at the end of this January. It was very hard to get the Mandarin male pairs for some reason. And so those were the last pairs that we eventually succeeded in getting. So I'm going to use a balanced corpus for the correlations on 126 pairs and a larger corpus of 139. Okay, so here are the findings so far. First of all, we found that people's ability to detect deception does correlate with their ability to deceive. So people who are better at detecting lies are better at lying as well. This holds across all, this is an interesting result for some of us, it holds across all subjects, but it's strongest for females. So females who are good at lying are general, in our corpus better at detecting deception. And we found no difference between English and Chinese speakers. We also found that subjects who are better at detecting deception are more likely to predict that their partners have lies, and vice versa. So if you're not so good at detecting deception, you're more likely to predict that your partner is telling the truth. So this may have some correlation with parole officers and criminals in their behavior as well. We looked at gender, ethnicity, personality, and the ability to deceive. And we found that there was no effect of gender or ethnicity across subjects, but we did find some personality correlations. So extroversion was significantly negatively correlated with ability to deceive. And this is particularly true of English males. So we don't want to do any stereotyping here, but it's an interesting observation. We did find some tendencies, however, in Chinese female extroversion was positively correlated with ability to deceive, and American female conscientiousness negatively correlated. So we are finding some effects of personality, not as many here as we hypothesized we would find, but we have more work to do on this. One of the problems with using personality scores is that they're it's hard to bin them into categories of high, medium, and low. But what we're doing is some clustering experiments to try to address that issue. And we found actually, and unfortunately, but this is life, that there was no effect of personality factors in deception detection. So this is contra our findings for English speakers in the previous study. And so, as I said before, we're working on better ways of modeling the personality information that we have so that we don't have to look at raw scores, but we can look at things in clusters. We did find some interesting results in people's confidence in their judgments. So ability to detect deception was negatively correlated with confidence in judgments for all of our subjects. And what we think is happening here is possibly that people who are not so confident in their judgments are asking a lot more follow-up questions and getting a lot more evidence so that eventually they make a decision that turns out to be the right one. And this was strongest for females. And we also found some results for negative correlation with confidence for males, which was strongest for Chinese males. And a final set of results on personality factors and confidence, we found that neuroticism was negatively correlated with confidence for Chinese female subjects alone. And openness to experience was negatively correlated with confidence for all of our subjects. So these are some factors that we have to understand and we have to be able to explain. We are finding some interesting things that we didn't know before. So now I'm going to turn to some classification results that we have. And this again is on an unbalanced corpus. And we're using the same sorts of acoustic and prosodic features that we used before in the previous study. We're using acoustic features and we're also including gender, ethnicity, and the personality scores. We don't have the lexical features yet because we're still working on the alignments. We have to do some hand tweaking there. And we used Weka and 3 different types of machine learning classifiers. And for all of those of you who are in the room who are saying, why didn't you use deep neural networks? That's next on our list. You have to now. It's just inevitable. So here are some results, and again, they're very preliminary. And what I want to point out is we got our best results of accuracy just using acoustic features. We got about 65, 66% accuracy. And actually, this is much better than the accuracy we got using the same features on the previous data set, the smaller data set. So we're very optimistic that this will improve once we can add additional lexical features, which prove to be a lot more important, unfortunately, for speech people than the acoustic and prosodic features, although those do add something. So I now want to turn, how much time do I have that? About 3 minutes? Okay, fine. I'm going to turn now to some stuff that we are just doing, which is kind of interesting. First of all, we thought, I told you that we asked a bunch of different kinds of questions. And our idea arose that maybe people are better at detecting deception on answers to some questions versus other questions. And in fact, this is what we find. So this just shows people's ability to detect deception is in the solid black line. The dotted black is the overall correct incorrect guesses when people were lying. So which questions are they better able to detect correctly, and in which questions are they better able to detect a lie? And the red line is the mean confidence score. So what you see here is that on some of these questions, and at the moment, unfortunately, don't have the actual questions, but I remember them now because I was just looking at them. So people were better able to guess whether people were lying about whether they owned a cat, for example, than whether they were lying about whether they loved their mother better than their father. They were also better at detecting deception on things that, like how much, so in particular, female interviewers were better able to detect deception on the question of how much, what's the most you ever spend on a pair of shoes. For some reason, this is something that they were very, very good at. Perhaps they could calibrate a little better than the male interviewers. So clearly there's some differences here. And what we wanted to do was try to figure out how could we categorize the questions that were easier versus harder to detect deception on. So we looked at first the yes-no questions versus the more open-ended questions. So yes-no questions, we asked them, we came up with these questions before everyone owned an e-reader. And so we asked them, do you own an e-reader of any kind? And this was back when, I mean, this was like 2-3 years ago. Not everybody owned an e-reader back then. And also, an open-ended question would be, who ended your last romantic relationship? We also distinguish between, we classified our questions into sensitive ones, intrusive, threat of disclosure, social desirability, to non-sensitive questions. So this was, who ended your last romantic relationship, was kind of a sensitive question, versus, do you own an e-reader of any kind, which was not a very sensitive question at all. And here's some preliminary findings. So we found that all of our interviewers were better at guessing true-false for yes-no questions than for open-ended questions. Does this strike people as reasonable? I mean, to me, this seems pretty, yes-no questions seem to elicit fewer follow-up questions. So, do you own an e-reader of any kind? What's a follow-up question to that? Well, why don't you own an e-reader? Have you all ever thought of owning an e-reader? But do you, who do you like better, your mother or your father? You could ask a lot of follow-up questions to that. So only the English interviewers detected lies to yes-no questions better than to open-ended questions. But overall, the entire larger corpus, this was true for. And we found many differences in who you were paired with. If you were paired with a woman and you were a man, or if you were paired with a man, or if you were paired with a native speaker of Chinese versus a native speaker of English. We also found that all interviewers detected truth and lie better in sensitive questions than in non-sensitive questions. Now this actually kind of confirms our initial hypotheses that people are going to display more emotion and more emotional content in their speech if they're talking about something that's very sensitive to them, as opposed to if they're talking about something that's not sensitive, like whether they own an e-reader or not. Now the last thing I want to talk about is something that we didn't expect to find at all. That sometimes when you're doing research, the thing that you set out to study is not the thing that ends up being incredibly interesting and opens up a lot of new fields for you. So we looked at our baseline interviews. Now recall that we had people come in, we sat them in the booth, and one of our experimenters asked them a whole bunch of different questions just to get them to talk. We weren't really interested in the answers at all. So we'd say things like, tell me how you decided to come to Columbia? What's the best food you ever ate? What did you do this past summer? And we didn't ask everybody all of those questions. We just wanted to get them to talk. So we got 3 to 4 minutes of speech from these norming interviews. We originally just expected to use those as a way of norming the interview corpus. And what we found, and this is really recent, this is in the past couple of weeks actually, that these 3 to 4 minutes proved to be a very good classifier of ethnicity, gender, success at deception detection, and also at predicting personality scores. 3 to 4 minutes of speech. This is really, to me, extremely interesting. You're taking a very short segment of speech and you're able to predict very accurately, well, whether somebody, okay, ethnicity maybe, whether somebody is a native speaker or not, maybe. But gender, interesting. Success at detecting deception, we can predict that by listening to or analyzing just what people said to us in the beginning interview. That's really kind of intriguing. Because what it suggests is that you might be able to determine who would be a good interviewer if you are hiring interviewers in the military or in the police. You might be able to at least filter people by simply analyzing a short segment of speech. That may be too wild a conclusion to draw, but so far that's the hypothesis that we have, and that might be a very good use. So it's very promising for results of identifying lots of different information from a very short segment of speech. We're looking at here at acoustic and lexical information. Okay.
I have a question.
So,
I had a quick question.
yeah.
So did you get the ground truth in this background question also, whether they were lying or not?
I beg your pardon?
For these background questions, did you also get the ground truth, whether they were lying for the basic questions or not?
We told them to tell the truth, and we believed them. I think they preferred to tell the truth. It was a lot easier. So for these, we did, you're right, we just assumed that they behaved correctly. Okay, so a couple of other things that we're doing with this data. We started talking, this study is funded by the U.S. Air Force Office of Scientific Research. And we were talking to some people at the last PI meeting who are very interested in laughter and whether people can recognize fake laughter, like you ask somebody to laugh, versus spontaneous laughter. And they said to us, gosh, do you think you could give us some samples of people laughing when they're lying and people laughing when they're telling the truth? And we could see if people can distinguish. Is this a lie laugh or is it a truth-telling laugh? And we're also looking at acoustic or prosodic characteristics of those laughs to see if we can actually distinguish those automatically. So this is something that pretty interesting and ongoing research. We're also going to do a lot more classification experiments with the full data set and the full set of features that we're planning to look at. And we're also looking at the question of whether you can use this data to identify things like when do people trust other people, which is of great interest to the government at the moment. Not only to induce trust in other people, but to decide when somebody is actually trusting what is being said to them. Because if people accept as true something that is a lie, or if they accept as true something which is true, both of those factors indicate, we think, that they trust that person. So we're making, instead of looking at deception, we're going to be looking at trust, but using the same kind of data as a proxy for if belief in a lie can be constituted as trust. So that's another way of using this data. And we're also, of course, going to do a lot of clustering experiments to see if we can actually come up with ways of clustering people to identify the different kinds of behaviors that they use when they're lying versus when they're telling the truth. So can we come up with types in terms of clusters of the kind of factors that we're looking at now, including the personality factor? So that's the hope. At any rate, here's the publications, and I have to thank the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. And thank you very much.
Any questions?
I was curious, so we have two populations. We have second language speakers of English, and we have native speakers of English.
Right.
Acquisition of information is a difficult thing. And so
Yes, I do know that.
So, is either in the pre-test where you're determining people's English fluency, or so was there something in the pre-test that examined their intonational fluency?
No, and actually we're not looking at real intonational contours. We're just looking at pitch range here for now. But I totally agree with you. In fact, you can tell whether somebody is a native speaker or not by looking at their intonational, the intonation that they use. We've done some work on that before, and actually with native speakers of Chinese for the ETS. Yes. So that would be a confounding factor.
Right.
If we used it, right.
So then it makes me think about later on when we talk about the success of using the prosodic cues, the basic cues that you're looking at, whether or not is there greater success if you divide by population?
No. So I don't think that the prosodic cues that we're using, we should actually look at pitch range differences between the two factors. We haven't gotten to that level yet, but you're absolutely right. We should see if there are some commonalities that we have to adjust for. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. That's good. Yeah.
If you see the baseline, when you're measuring things like changing pitch, you change from something, right?
We're normalizing. We did two.
Was it within like the decline, or was it from that baseline setting?
We've done both. We've done it within the session and also from the baseline norming. And I think that baseline norming is probably a better way to do it. We're also interested, though, in analyzing another feature that I didn't mention, which is whether people who have trained better, that is, who start talking more like the other person, are better at detecting deception. It sort of goes along with the openness to experience and agreeableness. You know, you're more socially apt, as it were, and we think that may be a factor. We've studied that a lot in other corpora, and we're going to do it in this one too, because we've got a lot of data.
I'm the point, follow up to Christian's point. So bilingual speakers, in general, when they speak a second language, so they have higher cognitive load. So I'm just slightly worried about the cognitive part.
If we found real differences between ability to deceive or to detect deception based on the ethnic background, yeah, we would be worried that that was part of it. We originally proposed to do not just native speakers of English and Mandarin Chinese, but also some Arabic dialect. And we weren't able to get enough Arabic subjects to do that. So that would have been a way of at least trying to address the question that you're raising, that there is more cognitive flow that way.
Yeah, or maybe have some Mandarin speakers, so televising Mandarin, or so we have some crossing.
I think that the good thing would be to do this in Mandarin Chinese as well. So people are speaking their native language as well as the, but due to the fact that we don't have enough native speakers of Mandarin working on this project, we did get them to help us with, you know, translating the NEO-FFI and things like that. But I think that's a good question. Yeah. Although actually, the federal government is interested in how non-native speakers speaking English might deceive or not deceive. So there's a practical benefit, I guess, for that. Yeah.
And you're making some kind of simple comparison with the polygraph and
Where I'm coming from is polygraph, for instance, is not admissible.
Yes.
In the
Thank
courts
goodness.
because it's not accurate enough.
That is
So
correct.
whether the defendant said the truth or not, this cannot be done in polygraph. I wanted any kind of test show that at least you are a little bit better than polygraph.
Yes. And we certainly do not intend to replace, to fully automate this because we would be scared to be responsible for doing that. What we're hoping to do in a practical nature would be simply to allow people who may not have access to some of these low-level features, they might not be sensitive to some of the acoustic and prosodic features, to have access to information that suggests that perhaps they should follow up with this person a little bit more seriously. But we don't want to predict deception, and we certainly don't want to take the place of an interviewer or interrogator.
In these criminal cases, they have the investigative phase and then the prosecutorial
Yes,
phase.
I know.
Your techniques would come in the investigative phase and narrow down the prosecution.
I would imagine
Not
so.
so much the prosecutorial phase.
Yes.
You have to use other evidence.
Right, so when it's taught, when it's being an interrogator, you start out as an interviewer, simply gathering information, then you start accusing people of something, whether you are sure they did it or not, and see what happens. So we actually followed that in our interviews for the first, when we actually control the interview. Yeah, Ken.
How often do people ask you whether you've told any lies in this lecture?
To the best of my knowledge, Ken, I have not told a lie. But I won't look at you when I say that. Never. You're the first one. Thank you. It's a question I haven't been asked. That's a good one. Yeah, back there.
This is related to the sort of sample population of college students.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a stereotype of parents being able to tell that the children are lying to them. And I was wondering if age differences are kind of like, people have different amounts of experiences and there's an age difference. Maybe.
All of our subjects in this study were Columbia students.
Right.
Yeah, so there were no age differences to speak of.
So the second question was, do you know if the fact that you have to self-label as you're telling the lie influences your ability to lie?
That you have to sit where?
Self-label, you have to actively press
yeah,
something.
people always ask. That is a question I have been asked before. They have to, so the cognitive load should be the same whether they're telling the truth or lying. They have to press a different key. So they're doing the same operation whether they're lying or telling the truth. So at least it should equal out. Yeah. And they didn't. Actually, it was much easier. In the first experiment, we had them pressing a pedal under the table, and some of them had trouble doing that because their legs were too long. So that's why we went to the key press. That would seem pretty easy. They just sat there with their fingers on the keys and didn't want to. Yeah. And hopefully they didn't have much cognitive load in deciding whether they were lying or not in the previous utterance. Yes. The person in the very back, and then you, and then you.
So I'm not entirely sure if I understood correctly. Did the interviewer not know anything about the person they were interviewing?
They had never met each other before, and we kept them apart until they actually went into the booth.
I don't know, is an interviewer better at detecting deception if they know about the person they're interviewing, or their history, or their background?
We would suppose so, because, they might know where they were born, for example.
Having like past audio samples from that person, would that, like, if you have like some sample of that person telling the truth from the past, would that be something that would benefit?
Well, I can tell you on our previous study, we actually gave people, for the first chunk of each of this is for the judges who had to judge truth or false. We actually trained them a little bit. We allowed them to get some feedback on whether they had guessed truth or lie better, and they made no difference. They weren't able to learn characteristics of that person. They didn't see the person, they didn't know the person, but at least they had a lot of samples that they could train on, and it didn't help. It's a hard task. deception detection is very difficult. Yes, Rohini.
Maybe I missed it, but it seems sort of intuitive that the longer they speak, the utterance length. Is that should be correlated with the better prediction?
You mean like the more data they have?
The longer they speak, if you two false questions, it's hard to tell.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why I think that yes/no questions were, different from the more open-ended questions. There's just not much more data, you can get from a person if did they own an e-reader, did they own a cat? Although they weren't very good at, actually they were pretty good at detecting whether people lied about owning a cat. So there's something in pets that people know about.
I was just curious, did the interviewers get immediate feedback as to whether they thought if the person was lying or was it at the end of the...
No. The only thing they found out at the end was how much money they got. And sometimes they were very surprised. Yeah, there was no correlation between people's, what they thought they had done, how well they thought they had done, with how well they had done.
I was wondering if I knew my last guess was right, I could...
Exactly, then you'd know what to think of, what to do next time. No, they didn't get it. Somebody else back there had a question?
So it's about the line game data set. So most of it is collected, so people premeditated the game. How about it generalizing it to a general situation where questions are asked off guard, like
Well, some of the questions were off-guard questions, right? Because the only thing that, for example, if I'm asked, do you own a cat? I thought about that, and I was able to, decide that I would say yes, or no if I would have said no. But you didn't know what follow-up questions people were asked, so you did have to extrapolate a little bit on those. So it wasn't that it was totally rehearsed and that everything that the person was going to ask them was rehearsed in advance.
But they were in a line mode, like a...
Well, yes, totally.
But it's not the case in the general sense where, we just have a conversation and all of a sudden there's a question and...
Right, so what this paradigm was trying to mimic was people who actually intend to lie about something, and they may know what that lie is going to be, but they can't anticipate all the follow-up questions that people were asked. So for example, if you were at the airport and people start asking you, well, do you have anything to declare? Do you have any gifts? Are you carrying any liquids or something? If you're planning to lie, or if you're carrying a bomb, you would say, no, I'm not carrying a bomb, but you wouldn't know all of the other questions that people might ask to elicit whether you really are or not. Of course, they'd probably just check their bag. Yeah.
Okay, Jeff, you have the last question.
Sure. So, this seems to have the potential to be extremely disruptive of human relationships and also encourage really large-scale surveillance of people. Audio surveillance is... I would think so, right? So, how do you handle that sort of future of this type of work? Because it's just so easy to record audio. It's way easier than video. There could be hundreds of recording devices in here that you're totally unaware of. And at least right now, it seems like most governments, and I don't know, and you're free to lie about this because you probably know, don't necessarily collect content, on this level. But if they found out that I could do something like this, it seems like it would encourage that sort of collection on a very wide scale.
Let's look at our results, right? So, if we were doing 98% accuracy, I'd be worried. If you were 80%, I might think this could be used for bad as well as for good. This is just another tool. It's a way that people could assess, whether they think somebody is lying or not. It's just a tool. I don't think that it's going to necessarily, if it were something, if people take this too seriously and say, I'm using your classifier and I know that you're lying, but there's no basis for doing that. There's too much error here for anybody. The
But if you look at the polygraph, I mean, that was misused for decades. People knew it wasn't
Yes.
accurate, but it doesn't stop people, right? Like, they
Yeah.
want it to be right.
Yes, or people from using this to decide whether their students have cheated on the exam. I think it's a much larger question, whether you think that it's useful to have additional tools to decide whether somebody is telling the truth or not. And if you don't, then you probably won't support this with your funding. Right. Yeah. So for us, it's just a scientific inquiry, really, in the same way that the others are. I mean, many things could be used wrongly for bad effect, and I agree with you. That would be a bad thing.
Well, on that note, we have refreshments back in 310 Davis Hall.